Welcome, everyone. We're going to be talking about AI data ethics. We can get really geeky, we can get really theoretical, and we want to treat this as more of a discussion, and everyone should feel welcome to join, jump in. I am going to lean on Philip Resnick, who's joining us this morning from the States, because I know that you're doing a lot of amazing work in this space and have some really interesting views on even the digital mental health, the data crisis. And so we'll come to that in a second, but just to welcome everyone in. If it gets too technical, please jump in and say, I'm lost, or if it's not technical enough, jump in and say, go deeper. This is our space to use. And I should say that the recording will be disseminated far and wide, let's say. So let me just add a couple more people in, but I will, just initially, Philip, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you all are doing well, whatever time zone you happen to be in. My name is Philip Resnick. I am a professor at the University of Maryland, which is quite close to Washington, D.C. I have a joint appointment. Half of me is in something called the Institute for Advanced Computer Studies and half in the Department of Linguistics. I'm a language guy. I am married to a clinical psychologist, Rebecca Resnick, who is also a co-author and partner in crime. She's a practicing clinician. She has a practice with about 26 or so people working for her. And so a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is kind of dinner table conversation that our 16 and 13-year-olds are probably kind of sick of. So I come to the table as a computer scientist who has deep interests in mental health. I do work particularly in the area of suicidology, and I also have collaborations going on involving schizophrenia and depression. I'm delighted to see and meet folks here today and have the conversation.
Awesome. Okay, so and this is an open invitation to anyone who wants to at any point introduce themselves as well. So I've asked Philip to do it. I won't introduce myself because I'm just so bored of that. But yeah, and you're like on my website. But anyone who wants to say their background, please do at any point. But I'm going to pose the first question to Philip about the data crisis. So I think this is a very interesting term in mental health. Can you explain what do you mean by the digital mental health data crisis, or even mental health data crisis?
Thank you. The reason I'm smiling is that what you're actually inviting me to do is what my wife calls my data rant. And so I'll try to give me a
Don't
if I
worry.
go off too far. The thing that is probably most important for people to know is that progress in using computational methods, today's computational methods, requires communities of people working on the same problem on the same data set. Okay, I need to emphasize that. If you need an example of this, look at the rise of deep learning over the past decade or so. Data sets like ImageNet, right, which are big publicly available data sets, and an entire frenzy or flurry of progress because everybody was working on the same thing. Did this work? Did this work better? And there's this constant progress of people working on the same thing. Healthcare is dramatically different. If you look at healthcare data that is in the natural language processing arena, which is where I work, and I would argue that language data is absolutely central. I mean, a great deal of what clinicians do is a form of language analysis in interaction with their patients. If you look at the way the work is done, what we are using in this field is multiple orders of magnitude less than what people have in any other area of AI. In the United States, the HIPAA law and the privacy protections, if you read the law carefully, it actually lets people do a lot more than they think they can do. But what's driving this is fear. Organizations are scared to share their data because they're worried about the implications of it, the optics of it. And as a result, I would argue that, and I have data that could support the idea that natural language processing in healthcare in general, and I would argue mental health as well, is literally 10 years behind the state of the art doing things in other areas. And a consequence of this problem is that there's multiple generations of really smart grad students and researchers who just go work on something else because it's just too hard. And people want to work on interesting problems and interesting technical issues. And even if they feel like mental health is an area they want to work in, it can be just so hard that this balkanized thing where if I'm lucky, there's a data set from some professor in the medical school and I can collaborate with them, right? These things just don't exist. And so what's happening is it's very, very difficult to get the critical mass. And that is, in a large nutshell, the data crisis that I tend to rant about.
Thank you. I enjoyed your rant. As always, if people want to jump in and say anything, please do raise your hand or just blurt it out, because I often get distracted as well because I'm so focused on what you're saying. But yeah, okay, the rant was good. Oh, we got a hand. I was going to ask you to then tell us about the future, but Jeremy, please join the rant, or the opposite.
Philip, thank you so much. It's really nice to hear you talk. How do we get the language insight into language data naturalistically as it occurs in therapy sessions?
Well, I mean, this actually connects with the question that Becky was going to ask about the future, right? How do we get past the data crisis that we're talking about? And therapy sessions are a very interesting variety of data. Because they are naturally occurring, but within a specific environment, as opposed to, for example, monitoring people's language behavior in what Glenn Coppersmith has dubbed the clinical white space, which is the space in between the encounters with providers. So I think that may be a useful contrast to structure the conversation, talking about the things that happen in the clinical setting versus in the white space between the clinical settings. So Jeremy, thanks for the question you're asking about in the clinical setting. If you ask, I mean, at one point, I asked a clinician, could we record your sessions and create some data? And they were like, hell no, because they're concerned about things like liability. Right, and the accountability, not just the privacy issues, but so there's a whole host of issues. There are, in fact, clinicians and researchers who do collect data, the audio and transcriptions of therapy sessions, but this is balkanized because, as I noted, there is no infrastructure for doing this thing in a central way. So I've just discovered, for example, there's a professor here at University of Maryland in the psychology department that I didn't know about, who has a large number of therapy sessions. I now have an appointment to have a conversation at the end of August saying, wow, about these data. That's an example of my privilege as a professor here at University of Maryland who has access to another professor who might have data, right? So Jeremy, the answer, how do we do this, right, is we need to create infrastructure that removes that element of privacy-related fear, and I can talk more about that because privacy is important, but there's a balance to obtain, and I can say more about that, Becky, if you'd like at some point. We need to find a way to enable the contribution of data into environments where it can be worked with safely by multiple researchers, all working together on the same data set. Now that said, once you have therapy data, there is a ton that you can do. Effectiveness of therapy, so measures, computational measures to try to look at the correlation between features of the therapy and outcomes, for example, in CBT and other therapies. Looking for red flag signals of self-harm that the clinician might miss. The list goes on. I'm sure all of you on the screen can come up with many other instances if, tying it back, we can manage to get access to the data. So I'm afraid I haven't really answered your question. I've just simply kind of floated up what I think the issues are.
And can we contrast that now with the white space? Because this is an area where I think, and I want to wait to the end to weigh in, but I think I might be in a position to accelerate fairness and to create a big data set. So yeah, I want to hear more. How valuable is the white space versus the clinical, or what benefits can you get from that kind of data?
Absolutely. And so the clinical white space is a term that was coined by Glenn Coppersmith and colleagues for the stuff in between. There's a marvelous slide in a paper from a group at UPenn that he borrowed for a paper of his that then I borrowed for like any presentation I do. And it shows one individual's activity little red marks for the healthcare encounters over the space of a year, and there's like 5 of them, and then little blue marks for social media posts, which look like this, right? So clinicians, if you think about it, I mean, in this country at least, an average psychiatric session is 15 minutes for like medication management. Somebody who knows they have a problem, right? A third of those people in this country, in the US, live in an area with a shortage of mental health providers and will have a hard time getting help, even if they know they have a problem in the first place, right? And they're going to wait for weeks and weeks. And during the pandemic, the general practitioners have become like they're handling mental health management for adolescents, right? And so the white space in between the clinical encounters already was important. It has become even more important over time, because it gives you a window into the things that the clinicians would not otherwise be aware of. And I need to emphasize, I am not talking about the current gold rush of AI, machine learning based things that claim to be able to read, scare quotes, what people are saying, and then tell you, are they going to harm themselves, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of value in the technological approaches, right? What I'm emphasizing is the clinician's window into what's going on in between for people. And that's enormously important and an opportunity we just didn't have before. And we have it now. We just need to figure out ways of ethically and appropriately connecting what people are doing in that clinical white space, which is not just language. It includes behavioral stuff, how they're sleeping, wearables. There's a whole host of things that people look at in this. We need to figure out ways of collecting and using that data ethically, both to advance the research and to provide tools that will enable the clinicians to have better visibility into what's going on with their patients in the vast tracts of time when they are not seeing their patients.
Okay, I'm just going to check in with the crowd, and anyone wants to weigh in. Jeremy wants to hear more about tech infrastructure solutions. I don't know if you want to dive into that or whatnot. Anyone else? I think one hand just went up. This is good. This is really helping my 3 o'clock brain. I'm getting into this.
Me plus coffee. I'm just going to send it to you across the web. Here you go.
Love it. I love it. Okay, yeah, Jeff, you had your hand up.
Can I? Someone got the hand up. Sorry, I can't see.
Jeff did,
yeah, I think Jeff did.
But okay. if you wanted, if it was related to what Phil just said, we'll stay in the flow. But then to Jeff.
Okay. So two things really. In researching building an appropriate platform for mental health, we heard universally from every private sector supplier and every therapist we spoke to, do not facilitate recording of our sessions. So yeah, that's great. That was easy. When we spoke to the NHS and the IAPT service providers, they said, no, we want recording. We want recording almost as standard. So I don't know if there's anybody from the NHS on this this event, but I'd be really interested to know, how often is that happening? Because we haven't actually deployed in the NHS yet. How often is that happening, and is that repository accessible? Because there's your gold mine, Philip, right? There's your gold mine. The second issue. I had to go up
right when you said that, and I don't know if that might be somebody who's responding to your question.
Yeah, so I used to be a lead clinician for a large IAP service and have a lot of knowledge of this area. So both in my own clinical practice privately and in the NHS, patients frequently ask to have a recording of their clinical session. The solutions that we currently have are pretty much rough and ready. So they're like little digital dictaphones, that kind of stuff that creates an MP3 file that we then squirt across to the patient on a shared drive. Really unsatisfactory. The more expensive solutions that a desktop device that does twin recording and things that send it off is not really been widely deployed, mainly because of cost. And what we would really like is to have a desktop device that could do a simultaneous recording that both the clinician and the patient can access in a secure way. I think that the challenges are, of course, cost around that, some of the IG challenges around that, the technicality of it, and then the security of it. But then you've got to go through a process of transcribing all the material. to do all the analytics and stuff like that for the AI application that you're talking about. But you know, I think there would be genuine concerns about how else that was being used, and we'd have to be very careful around educating people very clearly around what would be happening with their recorded information, and also the concern that actually, if you, because you can't give consent to you can consent to a recording, but you can't consent to a recording before you do the recording for its use in any other way. Because in a clinical session, you actually don't know what you're going to say. So you can't consent before that, you know, whatever I say is then going to be used elsewhere. You actually need to almost do the full course of therapy and at the end get the consent for the kind of other uses. But that's I hope that answers all your questions, Jeff.
Actually, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard that retrospective consent point before. I mean, all the digital IG components, yeah, obviously we have to deal with those, and that's what we're building into our platform. But yeah, the consent component at the end, that makes perfect sense, and hadn't really considered it. And the purpose element is an area I've been looking at, because obviously we are talking to a number of AI providers that want to bring their AI into our platform. And of course, I'm sitting there as the kind of, I guess, de facto ethics guy saying, yeah, but how are you managing that? And the only person I've ever heard really give me a clear answer is a researcher out of Colombia doing some very interesting work around AI in mental health. And he was really recognizing the interesting challenge where we were end-to-end encrypting all of the content, which makes it kind of difficult to create a recording. It's not impossible, but it creates new challenges. But then understanding that the purpose is so important, and that, you know, once the data is out, right, purpose limitation is really difficult, right? It's one of the, it's the core problem. And what he was doing was basically saying, well, actually what we do is we track the utilization of the data, and at any point in time, you can rescind your consent, remove the data from the data pool, and essentially that would also impact the way in which the algorithm that's derived from the data pool would be would sort of it'd have to kind of do like a rollback. And I thought it was really interesting thought process around that, because it creates a natural imperative of one of the three components of trust, which is accountability. And if the solution, if what you want is the data, but I have the power to rescind my data the moment I find that you're doing anything inappropriate to it from the point of view of purpose limitation, then suddenly that's one of the key enabling stepping stones of trust for me to be able to say, yes, you can have my data for that purpose. So I think there's some really interesting work going on there. It's a difficult and complex process from an IG point of view, but there are people working on it.
Can I jump in and respond? This notion of accountability, I think, is actually really quite important, because the fear of accountability, I think, is part of why you get near universal response from people saying, please don't record my sessions. I think that's an important part of it. Here in this country, you know, everybody's litigation happy and so forth. I'd like to just suggest as a thing to think about, is that accountability actually has many sides. And I think part of the problem here is that there is an imbalance. This gets to the ethical kind of discussion, right? When you are assessing risk, so with most of this discussion of the last couple of minutes has been very it's kind of been technologically oriented, right? But I think the core problem is not technological. These are not technologically difficult problems to solve, I don't think, if we do them. The bigger problem is the decision and the will to do them and to get people participating in it. There is an accountability. People are concerned about, for example, data privacy for the individuals whose, say, sessions they are, the people being monitored on social media and so forth. And that, of course, is an enormously important point of view and an issue to think about. But people often miss the fact that, well, two things. One is that they are already giving more information than that out to other people who don't have their best interests at heart. That's number one. And the second has to do with accountability to other people, not just the individual, the patients. In other words, the need to act, the value of the data, the benefit that goes with the risk. On the first issue, I often will tell people, ask an audience, how many of you are single and dating somebody, and the hands go up, and then and how many of you decided that you wanted to give some app developer in California the name and address of the person you're sleeping with? Very few people keep their hands up. And then I ask, how many of you have location services turned on your phone? Right? If you've got location services for an app turned on your phone, then they know where you spend your nights during the week, and they know where you're sleeping when you're not at home. It is not difficult you're basically telling them who you're sleeping with if they want that information, right? If you're doing Google searches, if you're doing product searches on Amazon, if you are allowing third-party tracking cookies, you are already giving away your data to organizations whose incentive is not to be helping you, it's to make a profit. They're required to try to make a profit. And so the context of the data privacy ethics issue is often not presented in this bigger picture way, right? That says you need to assess the risks and in the context of what's already being done, right? In terms of the benefits, the ethical issues with data, right? The collecting of data is not just about the collecting of data. It's also, again, it takes a step back to the sharing of data. The Virginia Tech shooter, right, at a university here in the States where there was, a mass shooting, the signs were there. There were multiple people who saw different signs, and they did not talk to each other. They were siloed because you can't talk about some patient with another provider unless you have permission from the patient. Right? There was another shooting here in the States where, a kid was brought to the principal's office because they were ideating violence in some, doodling they were doing on a piece of paper. They called the parents in. The parents said, "Oh no, he's fine, send him back to class." And the counselors at the school did not take it a step further. Now, there may be many reasons for this, but certainly one of them is that there is a balance of the ethical concern on the risk as opposed to the potential risk to others or benefit to others, right? And so I just wanted to, again, I apologize for going on at length. The important thing here is this is not a technological discussion. I'm a technologist. The technology is very, very important, but the root issues are not primarily technological.
Thanks, Philip. Ben, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So the first is I've instituted some AI machine learning processes in the institution I used to work in. And the way we got around some of the data and analytic processes, we didn't move the data from the digital platform. So we fused the natural language processing solutions into the digital architecture, analyzed the data in situ in order to create benefit to patients that was directly applicable in their day-to-day clinical care. And so we got around it that way. And that, still an ongoing project, but it'll probably bear fruit eventually.
And Dr. Wright, could other researchers come into your platform?
No, because But that question, which is a second point I wanted to make, you may have heard of a chap in the UK called Ben Goldacre. What he set up is a unified data set that pulls together all the major health data sets and is basically reverse identifiable. So the data that's there, you can identify whose clinical data it is, but it's in a secure environment. And what he allows is for researchers to create analytic scripts, which the solution software then runs on that data. And then what you get back is the result. The challenge with that is that I'm not sure, and of course that's fantastic because you always then have, again, assured security. So both the models I'm describing, the data stays in situ, and then the kind of the profit goes to the mountain, as it were. The question, of course, is can you use that kind of model to train AI, machine learning, natural language processing processes, and I think that's a technical question. I don't know the answer to it, but it's probably worth thinking about that as a major data set.
Yeah, the answer is yes. If you can create an environment where other researchers can come in. So I along with my wife and Meg Mitchell, who a name some might recognize, she founded Google's ethical AI team and then subsequently, well, this is being recorded, so I'll be careful about what I say. But she's no longer at Google for what I consider to be unfortunate reasons. But the three of us founded a workshop series called Computational Linguistics and Clinical Psychology, which runs with the main NLP conference. And a couple of years ago, we partnered with a nonprofit, NORC, at the University of Chicago, which runs a data enclave, very much like what you're talking about. And we took a data set, put it there, and then as a proof of concept, held a competition, like Kaggle competition, like shared task on suicide risk prediction inside that environment. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, Doctor, right? That's the next step, right? Is the first step is to get the data into these secure environments so that the people who have access to the environment, but then what you need to do is find ways to do two things at the same time, which is a very hard balance. Number one, open it to the community in a carefully governed way, right? The technology needs to, for example, prevent copying and pasting off or FTPing stuff out or whatever it is. You have to be very careful on that. And at the same time, we need the people in these environments to be able to use the full suite of machine learning tools. And that's challenging because an academic like me and my students, we're used to doing pip install whatever, or conda, and install something and just grab any package we want, bring it up, bring the data in. When you're in a walled garden like that, right, that tension between the careful governance, right, and the ability to unleash the full arsenal of machine learning, those stand in tension with each other. And by the way, I have to say, I noticed a chat thing go by saying somebody loved the FTP reference. Yeah, I'm kind of old school, what can I tell you?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump in a little bit here and get a higher level perspective rather than just getting into the technical stuff again. So I'm a co-founder of Hip Hop Site, co-founder of Combat, and we are ambitiously preparing to do a huge study. With the power of hip hop, we can get engagement with artists. It's really a different level. So what we want to try and achieve is getting 290,000 participants in a span of 3 months to voice to text their rap or their lyrics, all this kind of stuff. I won't go into the detail about why, but this will, sorry, why, because it's mental health and we want to support people. But I won't get into the weeds about it. But we want to be responsible and we want to be different. So when you were saying, Philip, about accountability, we see it as responsibility. So hip hop is a global language, a global culture. So some people will rap first half in Korean, second half in English or in and out. So rather than like what we want to do is accelerate fairness and take on the responsibility of having data that's so hard, so complicated, so messy, so hard to translate, so hard to decode. But your point about bringing in a huge amount of people, we need to do that. Otherwise, I feel we couldn't tackle this issue. So we're really flipping it, putting all the responsibility on us, like, of course, cybersecurity and all these things. But when it comes to tipping the balance, we really want to tip it in terms of accelerating fairness by creating a huge, 25+ billion data point data set and in very safe, authentic ways. So I don't know, I feel like just as not a provider, but at the start of a journey, we want to see it different. We want that responsibility. We want those challenges of language, things not being easy, but we need a big team. And so we need to be open. So but it's scary. It's certainly not the natural intention of just keeping it to yourself and protecting. But I think we need more efforts and initiatives that really flip it on its head and people take on the responsibility. But I just thought I'd throw that in there as like a non-technical thing about what new approaches that we can take, or what can we do to accelerate fairness, accelerate algorithmic testing bias, and just really trying to look at outcomes that support different demographics and populations. So yeah, just throwing that in there for people.
Well, I'll simply, I just want to support the idea of getting a very large data set. If you have smaller subpopulations, particularly intersectional populations, there is it's very, very hard. The sample sizes are so small that it's very, very difficult, right, to be able to make progress on these things. And from an NLP perspective, working on non-majority languages raises yet another set of enormously challenging issues. That said, I will say that one of the things that you need to think about as you move in the direction you're talking about, whatever you develop based on these things needs to have the equivalent of an automobile's check engine light, particularly when you're learning from smaller samples and therefore the error rates may be higher. You mentioned multiple languages. I read an article a month or two ago about the fact that there were doctors in emergency rooms using Google Translate. And I was horrified because I call this the paradox of quality, right? If you're doing stuff that, particularly stuff that is trained on majority stuff and it gets so good that you begin to trust it, the paradox of quality is that it gets so good that you trust it, and then it becomes so important for the technology itself to tell you when you shouldn't trust it. That's what a check engine light in your car does, right? We trust our cars. You don't even think twice about it, right? AI doesn't have check engine lights, but it could. Confidence estimation is not a rocket science kind of problem. So if you're doing the stuff that you're talking about, Becky, if you're taking this large data set and developing things, and you're thinking in terms of the smaller subpopulations of what you can learn from this, that issue of the check engine lights becomes all the more important, because the people who are the consumers of whatever the technology is producing are likely not to be from the culture or demographic group or intersectional group that you're talking about. So it becomes all the more important for the technology to say, look, I'm doing my best to make a prediction or translate or whatever the heck it's going to be doing. But it becomes all the more important to say, maybe this piece I didn't get right, as opposed to you just trusting the technology.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't checked the chat, but if anyone wants to say anything from the chat or comment on the chat, I've been so engrossed in the conversation. Right. Well, Philip, I think you're done.
Great, we've solved all the problems. Go do it.
But I suppose, yeah, please weigh in because it's
Jeremy.
Oh, here we go. The hands up. All right, Jeremy.
Yeah, I did in another project. I did a look at a mental health trust notes. Their notes. And I think there were 20 million notes. We did a trawl of them, and they varied between 3 words, 3,000 words, and there was, I think, probably 35% of them had no notes whatsoever. So actually, I can see just simply about the recording of what's been done as being kind of crucial, let alone the finer art of machine learning sets. Actually just being able to say what was done, even if to be protected as, I mean, I must say I'm glad a lot of my sessions aren't recorded, but because I swear an awful lot and I'd hate it to be kind of played back to me. But just frankly, I think, but for the protection of the therapist generally, on the basis of a litigious opportunity, and maybe there is the agreement of both parties to use it somehow, but actually just the recording just out of practice just seems at the very least a baseline, let alone the descriptors of what actually occurs within the session.
Can I ask you a question, Jeremy? That what you've just said brings to mind. I promise it's okay, really.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was just getting ready to launch into the Monty Python "What is your name?" routine. No. So here's the question. The thing that you're raising about stuff in session, I'm noticing that a number of other people people who've been participating in the conversation. I mentioned earlier the distinction between the clinical white space and the clinical encounter sorts of things themselves, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the linkage of these things. The big challenge with the clinical white space is you don't have ground truth data on what the person's actual condition is most of the time, unless you also have either questionnaire data that you've collected from them or actual clinical evaluation that's being done. And it seems to me that you're your comments are thinking about what happens in a session on the one hand, but you're also thinking in technological terms on the other. And I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts might be on the potential ways that one might actually be able to link these things, because we're going to hit a wall with the clinical white space data if we don't actually have good clinically validated data to use in our learning?
I think that, I don't know if you heard me rant in the last session, but we've got a problem because the data often we collect can be disorder specific questionnaires. I think you're right. I think the idea of wearables and what's happening live with people is really interesting. We used to do, we used to have bleeps, and we used to ask people what they're thinking about something or other at this time when the bleep goes off. And, it's kind of useful to get that sort of insight into live data. But what we have mostly is the therapist reported experiences within the session, and particularly for where the therapists hold a massive amount of power about what they say, what's happened. They say what's happened, and imagine children being taken away as a result of recorded sessions not being recorded and not being equitably discharged between the participants. So the equity of understanding language is left to what was said, even just what was said, let alone memory problems, which are disordered both in therapists and people with mental health problems. And we have that as distortions and those shortcuts. So I think actually having some sort of notion of objectivity about what is said, I think is really, really important. And I think the insight between session data, it might decentralize or maybe help the idea of what's done in sessions. My rant in the last bit, sorry, Jeff. My rant in the last bit was also Marvin Goldfried, who's getting on, talk about integrating psychotherapy research, saying we're just in a bit of a mess because we can't even describe what happens, what we see between us as therapists. So it's like, where are we standing? We all see the same thing and we go, well, that's a la-la, and you go, it's a woohoo, and it's just, where are we? The science of this is rubbish in terms of mental health. I'm with you on the data.
Jeff, you should comment now, but I want to come back to that, Jeremy, because it brings up the idea of categories and diagnostic categories and other category systems, which I think would be interesting to talk about in a technological context. But Jeff, you go first.
Yeah, just to sort of support Jeremy's viewpoint there is that, coming into this sector as a pure digital person and not a therapist in any way, although I've spent the last 2 to 3 years doing nothing but studying the sector, is that what was really interesting to me was that you largely engage with therapists who have their X number of hours a week with a patient, and there's this black space in between. And the digital world is entirely connected. So what's very obvious to me is that digital platforms should be filling that gap and facilitating that engagement in the black space. And it actually aligns very well with the basic thrust of multiple initiatives I see out there around patient-centric care and putting the patient at the center, and finding ways to do that. So that's part of what we're also looking into is to how to, look at that care potential or care opportunity on a 24/7 basis. There's obviously a service challenge in there, which needs to be very carefully addressed. But I think, the move to digital creates new opportunities, and we need to think about, way beyond just the therapy session. And the amount of data that you can get between the sessions, it's a goldmine, because you're seeing an artificial view in that 1 hour a week, bottom line. And what you really need is the real view. And the question is, how do you get access to the real view in a consented manner from the patient? And that's an interesting challenge.
And consent by the organizations. I mean, there are organizations that simply will not facilitate this sort of thing, right? The clinical records themselves are highly sensitive, and companies that deal with them, hospitals and hospital systems that deal with them, are, at least in this country, very unlikely to be willing to share the data, even if to facilitate that, even if the patients were consenting. So I think one possible answer to this is that patients have rights to their own data, and maybe we need to take the organizations that are the repositories of the data out of the permissions loop, so to speak, and find a way to let patients. Glenn Coppersmith, who I mentioned earlier, had a data site that facilitated individual level data donation. You could consent to donate your data, your social media data in particular. And do that. And maybe what we need to do is find better ways to go directly from the patient population to the kinds of goldmine repositories you're talking about, and take the organizations that have other incentives, right, Certainly, the big companies have very different incentives, but the big organizations like systems, hospitals, and other organizations that are repositories of data, they have other concerns and incentives too. So it seems to me that one of the things that we ought to be looking at is finding ways to empower the patients to participate in contributing to exactly the kinds of repositories that we're talking about here.
I think you've got to be very careful there. Bottom line is, particularly as these are vulnerable people, their capacity to appropriately consent is a challenge, and their understanding of the consequences of consenting is very limited. Particularly in an internet world, the consequences to action is massively temporally displaced. What they did 5 years ago is what's going to impact them 5 years from now. And the easiest example to that is people who rather foolishly are sharing their DNA data with these DNA companies, and the consequences to their family and everybody that they know or physically related to, they just haven't thought through, because there's a direct correlation. Well, it's the same with the mental health data, that consequence of that sharing, and how it revisits, well, two things: you as an individual, or somebody or people that you know and care about. Actually, it's probably three things: people you know and care about, or society as a whole. And those two other things in particular, in fact, all three things of those, it's very, very hard for the individual to have a clear capacity to consent on. So there needs to be some controls and management around that. That's why I talked about the accountability element, with that ability to rescind data, the ability to say, now I truly understand, I want to change my mind. Right?
Yeah,
and there's a consequence on
Jeff.
you as the user of my data when I do it, and then 10,000 other people do it, because suddenly your algorithm falls apart and no longer works properly. Right? So now it's in your interests as the utilizer of that data to sustain the trust in me and to be highly transparent about what you're using that data for, and to ensure that I'm giving you as an individual the controls over that environment that make you feel comfortable. And once you've got transparency, control, and accountability, then you've got trust.
I agree with that, Jeff. Although I think it's I agree with everything that you just said, but I think it's very important to contextualize it in the context of the fact that many of the individuals you're talking about are already consenting to have data that is just as potentially consequential. They're already consenting for organizations that have no vested interest in their individual well-being.
Doesn't make it right.
They're giving that data away right now, and so it's very important when one is presenting the importance of governance, the importance of the issues that you're talking about. Right? It's important to contextualize this as against the backdrop of what is already happening. There's risk and there's benefit. There's misses and false positives, right? And we are sometimes unduly concerned with the false unduly is much too strong a word. We are focused more heavily on the balance of false positives, in the sense that there may be information out there that shouldn't be, right? Without thinking about the benefits of the information that could be used in order to improve societal benefit and even individual benefit. So there's a balance there that I just want to emphasize. I don't disagree with you. Everything you said is necessary, but I think it's very important to place it in a context.
Just be careful with that argument. It's the same argument Google used in the when they were having their standard when they started up, and they were "don't be evil" was their mentality. And as they transitioned into the 2000s and their business model changed, they dropped that thought process.
Which is precisely why we don't want organizations doing what you just described to be organizations whose primary responsibility is fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. An academic organization and a nonprofit organization, right? If I want to use the data, Google just can use it. Maybe they have internal ethical review. If I want to do a study, I want to do research on, if I get access to the kinds of repositories that Dr. Wright was talking about or others, I need to go through an ethical institutional review board that reviews exactly what I'm planning to do and monitors what I'm doing. That's the place, right? We have controls that the companies don't. And that's what I mean when I say we should be contextualizing this. If we're not contrasting ourselves with that, then we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Okay, we're going to loop other people in because I've seen some hands up as well. So Ben, you went up first and then Kath.
Yeah, so Jeff, I actually have pretty high levels of confidence in my patients' capacity to make decisions. And there are very few patients who don't have the capability to make the sorts of complex decisions that you're describing. The problem is not their capability to make the decisions. The problem is the misinformation and lack of information that they're presented with, and the lack of technical expertise and understanding the subtleties of the information. And they turn to us. They turn to me and they go, "Oh, doctor, what do you think I should do?" And they rely upon me to make a decision. Now, I'm probably, as the chief clinical digital officer, or now retired, but that's what I was probably one of the most informed people in my organization. I can tell you that at least for certain 5%, but probably more like 30% of staff just are clueless when it comes to digital. So the problem here is not, it's not the patients don't have the ability to understand and make these decisions, it's they just don't have the information. The information asymmetry is vast, and the people they look to inform them and advise them, their ignorance of these topics is vast. And I think that's the major problem in terms of that we're facing. Yeah, not sure. I mean, it's a difficult area.
I agree with that. In our engagement with the market, our internal observation is that we're mostly dealing with people who don't know how to ask the right questions, and even if they did, wouldn't understand the answers we gave them. And that's kind of our interesting challenge, because how do you create value in a digital context when you're talking to people who don't actually know what problem that they need to solve, right? Or avoid. It's kind of an interesting challenge.
Kath, do you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm not going to weigh in. I'm going to kind of go with both Philip and Ben in terms of what they've both said. I'm having the same, so it's just taken me 2 years to get through ethics because I'm working with children and taking particular data. And certainly in the world of where I mainly focus in terms of online harms, I have to ask those questions to get that data. And I think what Ben was saying there is exactly what I'm trying to teach the therapists. If you know the landscape and you know what can potentially happen to that data, you can give enough what we call informed consent for the people to be able to consent. I think what you're talking about, Jeff, and you and I have talked about this, are so many people are illiterate or have a deficit of knowledge within the digital space that they can't explain to their clients what's going to happen with that digital data. So they might say, well, I record you. And earlier on, I put something in about the students, and the students are wandering around with those tape recorders and they're not protecting them because they don't understand the risks, and they're recording things online and yada, yada, yada. So I think what Philip is saying is, we have to go to those places and have the right kind of ethical constraints, because yeah, absolutely, there is data being collected on people all over, because we are not, as a species, IT literate, let alone IT competent, which makes it sound so bad, doesn't it? But I don't mean it to be that way.
But Kath, my issue is this, is that institutions strain at the gnat and swallow the camel. So they strain at the gnat, they put your research through 2 years of ethical rigor, picking up minutiae, this and that. Now it's quite good to have the scrutiny, but then you've got individuals swallowing the camel, and I think the other flip side is that they torture themselves over the possible harms that might happen, They struggle over the possible harms when the moon is in conjunction with Jupiter, some rarity. But as Philip said, completely ignore the demonstrable benefits that even quite modest implementation of digital solutions or minor research projects will give to the person here and now. So I think those are the two big things, really: swallowing that, choking at the gnat and swallowing the camel, and falling over minor possible harms and ignoring actual real tangible benefits, preventing real tangible benefits.
Okay, great. We've got a couple minutes left, maybe 3-4 minutes, just so we can have a break before the next session on wearables, risks and rewards. And yeah, I suppose concluding thoughts, starting with Philip. It's not an easy thing to do, but what's on your mind right now?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. I feel a little awkward being kind of like picked out front and center with such a wonderful group as a whole of people. I really appreciate the conversation. So first of all, thank you, and thank you for organizing this whole thing. I think if there were one takeaway that I would emphasize, it is that we need to be having these conversations. Everybody is trying to solve this problem here, there, this repository, that research project, right? But there needs to be an infrastructure level solution, right? That involves both all of the steps of information, not misinformation, consent, collection of data, secure management of data, and finally, I have to emphasize, access to the data by entire communities of people to develop the next level of the digital technology that's actually going to help people.
Thanks, Philip. Okay, others want to weigh in? We've got a couple minutes. Otherwise, we've learned an awful lot. I think we've had a lot of hands up, but then I suppose, yeah, to thank you, Philip, and for your time this morning. And yeah, thank you everyone for actually making this a really like a collective conversation. I thought it was really interesting and fascinating, and I almost forgot the time that we've got another session after this. So yeah, I will save the recording. I will share, and I hope you're all connecting somehow. Let me know how I can help. And yeah, on to the next conversation, and hopefully great work that you continue to do. So thank you, everyone.